Well, thank you everyone for coming today at 8 o'clock in the morning, which I understand is a struggle, to attend our event, Challenges Facing Social Security, a discussion of the 2013 Trustees Report. We're very excited to have one of the public trustees here as well as a distinguished panel. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, Third Way, and the Mercatus Center for putting this on. To introduce our first speaker is Jason Fichtner of the Mercatus Center. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, Mark. I have the distinguished pleasure of introducing Dr. Charles Blahouse today. My name is Jason Fichtner. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. I am also an adjunct faculty at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins SAIS. So as a professor, I'm trying not to wear a tie whenever possible. Chuck is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, one of my colleagues. He currently, of course, serves as one of the 2 public trustees for Social Security and Medicare. He specializes in domestic economic policy, but his primary research interests include retirement security, with an emphasis on Social Security and employer-provided defined benefit pensions, as well as federal fiscal policy, employer-provided defined pensions, and entitlements, demographic change, and obviously also healthcare reform. From 2007 to 2009, Dr. Blahouse served as Deputy Director of President Bush's National Economic Council. From 2001 to 2007, he served as a Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy, first covering retirement security issues, and later encompassing energy policy as well. In 2001, he served as the Executive Director of the Bipartisan President's Commission to Strengthen Social Security. Dr. Blahouse's latest books include Social Security, The Unfinished Work, which is done by Hoover Press, and Pension-Wise, Confronting Employer Pension Underfunding and Sparing Taxpayers, The Next Bailout, also by Hoover Press. He has published in a number of periodicals, including National Affairs, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Financial Times, Politico, National Review, Harvard Journal of Legislation, also, oddly enough, Baseball Research Journal. Chuck is a very big fan of baseball statistics. And the Journal of Chemical Physics. His media appearances range from the Diane Rehm Show to Fox News. And one of the interesting things about Chuck, which most people don't realize when you come to Social Security or Medicare type entitlement events, is you get a lot of actuaries, a lot of economists up here talking to you about numbers. Chuck actually does not have his PhD in economics. He has a real PhD. It's in computational quantum chemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. So he's actually a science geek by training. He got his undergraduate from Princeton University, where he won the McKay Prize in physical chemistry. So it's a great honor to have Chuck Blahouse here today and introduce him. Chuck?
Well, thank you very much, Jason. Thanks, as always, for poor Jason gets the job of introducing me a lot, so I appreciate that. As I appreciate everything my friends at the Mercatus Center have helped do to help prepare for this event. I want to thank the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget for putting this together, and as well to Third Way for co-sponsoring it. I also want to thank all of you for coming out, as was said earlier, coming to listen to a discussion of Social Security's actuarial condition is a bit of a challenge at 8:30 in the morning. So I hope everyone is duly caffeinated, and off we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just plow right into the basic findings of the Trustees Report without much ado or description, and I'll leave the panel to follow to discuss what it all means. Those of you who know me know that left to my own devices, I can talk for a lot longer than 15 minutes about Social Security, so I better get moving right into the graphs without getting too carried away. Let me first just present this graph. This is a graph that is sort of a catch-all graph that has appeared in the Trustees Report for several years. It's affectionately known to insiders as the shark fin graph. For reasons that are probably clear from looking at it. And this has appeared for several years in the report, long since before I was a trustee. And it basically takes the past, the recent past and future of Social Security and puts it all in one handy picture. What you see along the x-axis is basically the passage of time. So you see Social Security finances as they are projected to flow going forward in time. And everything on the graph, as represented on the y-axis, is represented as a percentage of worker taxable wages. In other words, this is a percentage of the earnings of workers who are contributing to Social Security. So basically, this allows you to see basically what share of each worker's paycheck is being absorbed by the Social Security system, either in terms of the cost of paying benefits or the direct tax bite that it takes out. So if you see 10% on this graph, that basically means that Social Security is using up 10 cents out of every taxable dollar that workers earn. Now, what this graph depicts are the finances of the combined Social Security trust funds, and that's something of a hypothetical entity. We, in Social Security parlance, often gloss things over a bit. We trustees do this like everybody else does, and we have a tendency to sort of throw all of Social Security finances together in one big pot when we talk about the program. But technically, of course, Social Security has separate trust funds. There's a disability trust fund, there's an old age and survivors trust fund, and they all have to be maintained separately in order to avoid an interruption of benefit payments. But let me just make that approximation here on the next several slides and talk about Social Security as it would exist if we took everything and threw it into one big pot. Now, what you can see on this graph, the bold line that is depicted basically shows the rise in program costs. So you can see in recent history how program costs have been rising relative to the earnings of workers, and you can see how costs are projected to rise substantially further over the next couple of decades. And the thinner line crossing it is the income line. That's basically the tax revenue contributed to Social Security. Most of that is revenue from the Social Security payroll tax. A little bit is the income taxation of Social Security benefits. But that's basically the tax revenue that the program is bringing in. Now, if you look around 2010, you can see the point where Social Security started to cost more than it was generating in annual tax income. Now, even though at that point Social Security was paying out more than it was actually bringing in tax revenue, we could still make full Social Security benefit payments, and we can continue to make full Social Security benefit payments, at least from the combined trust funds, till 2033. What's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is that Social Security has a trust fund, and the trust fund basically consists of asset reserves that are credited to Social Security that basically represent the entirety of the past surpluses that Social Security has run, plus interest. And Social Security can continue to pay full benefits as long as there is a positive balance in that trust fund, and under our current projections, that combined trust fund would have a positive balance till 2033. And there is where you suddenly see a big payment shock under our current projections. You see a sudden reduction in the amount of benefits that we can pay of 23%, and thereafter you see an enormous gap between the amount of benefits that we can pay under current law and the amount of benefits that are being promised under the current benefit schedules. And of course, that sudden disruption in benefit payments is something that we all want to avoid. Now, why do we have this shortfall? Basically, if you understand three main factors, you really understand the ingredients of the Social Security shortfall. The first is simply demographics. We have many more beneficiaries to support relative to the number of tax-paying workers that are supporting them with their tax dollars. And we frankly have not adjusted for that adequately in how the program's statutory schedules operate. The second factor is the rise in per capita benefits. Benefits rise from one cohort to the next. They rise faster than inflation. They rise in real terms. Now, I'm not talking here about the COLA issue. I'm not talking about the consumer price index issue that you may have heard a lot about. That has to do with the annual adjustment to benefits after people start collecting them. What I'm talking about here is the way the benefit formula causes per capita benefits from one cohort to the next cohort to rise relative to inflation. And obviously, if you have more beneficiaries to pay because of demographics and you're paying them higher per capita benefits, those both strain program finances. And the third thing that contributes to the shortfall is Social Security's method of financing. This is not a savings program. This is not a program in which people are putting aside contributions and they're being saved and invested during their working careers and then they withdraw them in retirement. That's not how Social Security works. For the most part, the benefits that are paid directly from the incoming taxes paid by current workers, and then when those current workers reach eligibility age, then their benefits are paid in turn mostly by taxing the generation behind them. Now, why have I simplified everything down to these three factors? Well, if you understand these three factors, you basically understand what is producing our Social Security shortfall. Because if you didn't have all three of these factors colliding with each other, we actually wouldn't have a current shortfall. For example, you could have our current benefit formula and you could have our current method of financing, and the program finances would be stable if we weren't experiencing a decline in the ratio of workers to beneficiaries. Similarly, we could have our current demographics and we could have our current method of financing if we hadn't changed the method of benefit indexation in the 1970s. The old Social Security benefit formulas that were in place from FDR's time up through the early 1970s, those would actually still be in balance today if we hadn't expanded benefits at that time. And of course, the third issue is the pay-as-you-go financing. We could actually keep this system solvent with our current demographics and with our current benefit formula if we were actually saving all the contributions from current workers, and then workers then could withdraw them from those accumulations in their retirement. But it's because current taxes are being transferred to pay for the benefits of current generations that we have a system that is extremely sensitive to the ratio of contributing workers to collecting beneficiaries. So these are the three factors that colliding together create the shortfall. If we didn't have one of these three, we would actually be in much better shape. These are some graphs just to dramatize what I'm talking about. Here is a graph that shows the declining ratio in tax-paying workers to collecting beneficiaries. You can see that it's on a very severe downward slope over the next couple of decades. I want to call your attention to one thing. If you go back to the previous graph and you see the graph of program costs, you could see that around 2008, 2009, 2010, we had an upward surge in benefit in costs, and then a little bit of wiggling of the cost line, and then it resumed its upward slope, and then it levels off after that. You'll notice that the worker to collector ratio graph is almost that upside down. You see that little wiggle there in the early part, the latter part of the last decade, and then you see the very smooth downward slope of the worker to collector beneficiary ratio, and then you see it starting to level off in mid-century. So you can see the great sensitivity of the cost curve to the worker to beneficiary curve. Why do we have this declining ratio of workers to beneficiaries? Well, a good portion of the reason has to do with changes in fertility rates over the years. Post-war, we had the baby boom, and of course, those baby boomers are now entering the retirement rolls and swelling the ranks of the beneficiary population. And then after the baby boom, we had a baby bust. And so the number of workers who are now going to be paying taxes to support the baby boomers is a much lower fertility rate generation. We also have the factor of rising longevity. In addition to having more people by virtue of a large baby boom generation entering the retirement rolls, we're also living a lot longer than we used to be. And frankly, our system simply has not adjusted for that in any realistic way. If you look at 1940, we set Social Security's eligibility age at 65. Not only did we do that, but we actually reduced the age of earliest eligibility to 62 about 20 years later. And that actually became the most common age of claiming Social Security benefits, and it remains so today. But meanwhile, life expectancy at age 65, the number of years you expect to collect benefits if you start at age 65, has risen very dramatically. It's risen by 6 years through today, and of course by mid-century will have risen substantially further. So already you could see that today we're living on average 6 years longer at age 65, but most commonly we're collecting benefits 3 years earlier, and that's simply not going to work. Neither the normal retirement age or the earliest eligibility ages are set in a way that really realistically deals with how long people expect to collect benefits. And I would point out one thing, that it's often noted that life expectancy gains are different places in the income spectrum. People on the higher income side have greater life expectancy gains than people on the lower income side. But throughout the income spectrum, life expectancy gains have well outpaced what we have done with Social Security's eligibility ages. There's no group that's actually dying 3 years earlier than they were when Social Security was first created. So even a very substantial increase in the earliest and normal retirement ages would still barely adjust for the rising life expectancy that Americans are experiencing. We also have the factor I described before, which is that on a per capita basis, we are also paying benefits that are rising in real terms. This is a graph of scheduled benefit levels for your medium earner claiming at the normal retirement age, and this is all adjusted for inflation, and you can see that on a per capita benefit level, a per capita basis, we are paying or scheduled to pay benefits that are much higher in the future than we're paying today. So you put all these factors together, we have a lot more beneficiaries to support because of the baby boom. They're all living longer. We're paying them higher per capita benefits, and that's why we have a shortfall. So what do we do about this? Well, the short answer is, we as trustees don't make policy recommendations, but we outline the choices. If we were to act to fix the system today, the choices would be very, very difficult, but perhaps achievable. Just as a thought experiment, if you wanted to do it all by increasing the payroll tax rate, you'd have to increase it by that amount. If alternatively you wanted to deal with it by cutting benefits, you'd have to cut them 16.5% across the board if you enacted a solution today. Now, historically, it's been very unattractive to lawmakers to cut benefits for people after they started collecting them. So if you ask more realistically, how much would you have to reduce scheduled benefits if you confine them to people coming onto the rolls now, those benefit changes would have to be nearly 20%. And of course, you could enact some combination of these approaches, taking a little from column A and a little from column B. By way of illustration, just to show you, by 2033, if we actually wait to the point where the trust fund is being depleted, the choices become so onerous that at that point they really are implausible. If you wanted to do it all on the tax rate side, you'd basically have to increase workers' tax burdens by roughly 1/3. And whether you did this by the rate or the base, a sudden 1/3 increase in worker tax burdens is obviously a huge push politically. If you wanted to cut benefits across the board, at that point you'd have to do it 23%. Obviously, we're not going to cut benefits 23% for every beneficiary in America. People who've been collecting benefits for decades, the poor 95-year-old widow. That's just not something we have done. And that would apply to everyone. People already on the rolls, people newly coming onto the rolls, the rich, the poor, et cetera. If you wanted to confine your benefit reductions at that point to people newly eligible for benefits, even 100% benefit reduction would not be enough to balance the system at that point. So by 2033, this game is over. There's no way to do it in 2033, at least no way that's actually realistic. Our window of opportunity for dealing with Social Security is closing much earlier than that and is actually in the process of closing today. Now, remember earlier what I said about how Social Security doesn't have a combined trust fund. It has separate trust funds. It has a disability trust fund. It has an old age and survivors trust fund. That's very important for the current outlook because under current projections, one of these trust funds is going to be depleted in 2016. That's just 3 years from now. So we have to have legislation to deal with this very soon. We've now reached sort of the urgent stage. We've now reached the stage where we have to have action in just the next couple of years if we're going to avoid an interruption of benefit payments. Now, that is happening in 2016. Occasionally you hear people say, well, that's not really a big deal. We could just simply reallocate from taxes, some taxes from the retirement side of Social Security to the disability side. In theory, we could do that, but we need to be realistic about what that means. I mean, undoubtedly, the disability program could benefit from additional tax revenue, but I'm not so sure that the retirement portion of Social Security is the place to get it. The retirement portion of Social Security is actually facing an even bigger shortfall long-term than the disability system is. If you actually look at the 75-year imbalance in the old age and survivors program, it's actually 20% as opposed to 17% for disability. The percent of scheduled benefits payable upon depletion is 75% for the retirement portion of Social Security. It's 80% for disability. So the retirement side of Social Security actually has a bigger long-term shortfall. If we wanted to just reallocate the taxes from the old age and survivor side to the disability side, we would actually be shoring up disability at the expense of a retirement program that's actually in even weaker condition. This graph basically demonstrates that. The blue line here shows how the disability program has gone into a cash flow deficit in the last few years and is on the verge of depletion. But if you look what's happening long term, the old age and survivors program has a much, much bigger deficit over the long term. Now, what's happening is that people are now in the process of moving from the disability program to the retirement program. People hit disability at younger ages, and then when they get older, they convert to retirement benefits. So to simply reallocate taxes would be taking tax revenue away from the retirement side at precisely the moment that people are actually moving on to it. Now, part of the phenomenon here is that the retirement program is a lot bigger than the disability program. But if you just adjust for that, even relative to their sizes, the retirement program actually has the bigger long-term deficit. It's just that the disability program hit its strains first. So again, that's something we could do, but the far more responsible course would be to shore up both disability and the retirement sides of Social Security simultaneously and not try to improve one at the expense of the other. By any measure, we are now very, very late in the game when it comes to dealing with the Social Security shortfall. In my view, we do not have the requisite sense of urgency that we should, given how serious things have become. For perspective, in 1983, we had a landmark, basically, Social Security crisis, and we had a landmark series of reforms to deal with that. And there was a lot of pain that had to be allocated. We had to delay COLAs by 6 months. We had to bring all federal employees into the system for the first time. We had to expose Social Security benefits to income taxation for the first time. We had to raise the retirement age. We had to accelerate a previously enacted increase in the payroll tax. All of this was intensely controversial, and it almost didn't pass. We were literally just a few months away from not sending out the checks. Those exertions, severe as they were a little bit more than half as severe as what we would have to do today if we wanted to balance Social Security for the next 75 years. So we're basically in uncharted waters at this point. We don't know whether our political system can forge an agreement to close a shortfall that is as large as Social Security's has already become. And the more we wait to deal with it, of course, the more the problem increases relative to any previous experience of closing a shortfall of this magnitude. So it's very, very late in the game for Social Security. I think there's insufficient recognition of that, and we're really playing with fire in terms of our ability to actually get the shortfall closed at any point. Just one last point before I summarize. Sometimes you'll hear people saying, well, this is something that we can afford to deal with at a future date. The trust fund isn't depleted yet. It's not nearing depletion. Let's deal with it later on. And perhaps we won't have as big a problem to deal with as we currently project. That is simply wishful thinking, and I don't think it's really grounded in reality. The current Social Security shortfall, you have to understand, is not something that is hypothetically going to maybe develop in the future. It's actually something that's on the books now. The components of the Social Security shortfall consist of an excess of benefit promises over taxes collected for people who are already in the system. So it's not something that's yet to develop. That's what the shortfall consists of. And if you express everything in terms of a percentage of the wages of people who are now entering the Social Security system, you can see that the cost of paying benefits for people who are already in the system now, that would amount to about 9% of their wages. And if you subtract all past and future tax contributions made by current and past participants, you see that if we don't do anything to change the current scheduled benefit formula, younger generations are going to lose over 4% of their lifetime wages to the Social Security system. And that's just a consequence of basically saying if we're going to load up the changes on the younger generation who's going to get the worst deal from Social Security to begin with, it doesn't matter whether you raise taxes on them or cut their benefits, they're going to lose over 4% of their wages to Social Security. So if we want to deal with this program in a generationally responsible way, we have to do something to deal with the excess of benefits promised over taxes for people who are now in the system. Otherwise, the program is simply not going to be very effective in serving younger generations because it's going to be taking more money away from them than it is giving to them on balance. So in summary, we do have a substantial shortfall to deal with. It's driven primarily by demographics. And of course, the most immediate manifestation of that, the biggest problem, is that in 2016, the disability program is projected to be insolvent. We have to deal with that. That requires near-term legislation. And it would be best if we dealt with it without also weakening the Social Security Retirement Trust Fund. And now the delay to this date, which is unfortunate but is a reality, has brought us to the point where the difficulties we'll have in solving this problem substantially exceed what we took on even in 1983. And if we continue to delay, then we're going to just make the problem that much more difficult to solve and decrease our probability of being able to solve the problem at all. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you. Well, wonderful. Sir.
So the trust fund is a little bit squishy because it consists of treasury debt. But when it gets to where the trust funds run out, won't it just come from thank you. Won't it just come from general revenues?
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, people speculate about what would happen. Suppose we waited till 2033. And I think I agree with the thrust of your question, that if we get to the point where by 2033, we haven't closed the shortfall, and we're already in a condition where the program is putting huge pressure on the general federal budget from redeeming the assets of the trust fund, at that point is the path of least resistance to just say, forget about maintaining self-financing. We'll just have a direct subsidy from general revenues to the trust fund. And economically, things wouldn't look that different in 2034 than they would have looked in 2033. We could do that, and one of the things that I've been trying to impart in my writings and comments over the last couple of years is that that is probably where we're heading if we don't deal with the Social Security shortfall before then. And people should be cognizant of that, because basically that means we would formally abandon this idea that Social Security is going to finance itself. We would abandon the idea that people would be assessed payroll taxes that are sufficient to fund their benefits. We would abandon the idea that the program's benefits were in any way earned by the class of beneficiaries. Everyone would know at that point. It would be much more like Medicare. You'd have a substantial portion of the program that is financed from the general fund, financed with people's income taxes. There would be no connection between the income taxes people pay, and only some people pay income taxes, and the benefits they get. So this whole idea of Social Security's historic design is gone, basically, if we wait until 2033 to deal with it. Now, I have a paper on this, which talks about if this commitment to the self-financing ethic continues to erode and we get to that point, and we just have a direct general fund subsidy, we're going to have a very different type of Social Security system. Historically, Social Security has been treated very differently from programs that are funded directly from the general fund. No program that is funded from the general fund has wage index benefits, for example. Programs that are funded from the general fund are almost always means tested. They're almost always subject to very sudden changes in benefit levels and eligibility requirements. So if we get to that point, we may be in a situation where once we start general revenue financing of Social Security, then the whole policy landscape of Social Security changes, and you're much more likely to have means tests. You're much more likely to have people penalized for the savings they do outside of Social Security, and Social Security is going to have to compete within the general budget for financing each year in a way that it doesn't now. We could make that choice, but I just want people to be aware that that is in effect the choice we're going to be making if we don't deal with it before then. Yes.
Thank you. It's becoming more popular now to recommend that individuals delay collecting benefits till at least their normal retirement age or possibly later to get the delayed retirement credits. What's that impact on the trust fund? And do those people who elect to delay, are they jeopardizing future benefits to cutbacks?
Well, in theory, at least the way we calculate it, the way the actuaries calculate it, that effect is basically neutral for the trust fund, because the way Social Security benefits are calculated, there's an actuarial adjustment made to your benefits if you claim early or claim late. You get a lower level of annual benefits if you claim early. You get a higher level of annual benefits if you claim late. I actually believe that the trend towards delaying claims is a welcome one. I think it's overdue. Too often in previous years, we were simply encouraging people to claim at the earliest available age 62. That's still the most common age of claim, but that creates great risks. It creates special risks for women if you're likely to become more likely to outlive your savings. You get an earlier benefit, but you get a lower level of benefits, and you're exposed to more longevity risk, basically, the risk of outliving your savings with an inadequate Social Security benefit. So I see this as a welcome trend that people are starting to delay their benefits a little bit more. I think some credit is due to the large number of people who have stepped up. If you go online now and see advice columns about how people should approach their retirement decision, it's very different from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, they were just saying, everybody go ahead and claim at 62 and don't worry about it. And there's been a great effort made by a lot of groups to try to educate people about the risks of that decision, especially if you're a woman, especially if you are low income, especially if you don't have a lot of savings, it may be more prudent to wait. Now, I happen to believe that the effect of people delaying these benefit claims is probably more positive for system finances than our current projections show. The reason for that is that we do not really, only to an extent, but probably to an inadequate extent, we only partially reflect the correlation between people's date of retirement claim and how long they stay in the workforce. If people delay their retirement claims, they tend to spend longer in the workforce. They tend to generate more payroll taxes. They tend to generate more income taxes. That's good for the system in general. And I think we capture some of those effects in our projections, but probably not enough. I would like to see us do more.
You mentioned the three factors, and it seems like some of the logical conclusions should be drawn is to step one, freeze the present, and I'm one of the recipients, so I wouldn't mind a freeze from here. That will put pressure on this group to keep pushing out lawmakers to do something about it. Then reduce the future. And so the future generation will be upset, they pay more and their benefits are, so that's another pressure. Now, I think there was something mentioned in your introduction, Bush administration, so we didn't want it, but he was there and he wanted to reform it. We said, well, with Iraq war and all these other expenses, and Afghan war, and he has created too many expenses, let him forget about the privatization of Social Security. That would be another disaster in the world. So I'm glad we did do it, but it's time to think seriously what to do about it. So why not build these pressure points in the system so that people will push the legislators to do something what is more reasonable?
Well, I agree with the thrust of your question, that we basically should, acknowledge the pressure points that are there and act on them. And I think the main pressure points are the rate of per capita benefit growth. We have to deal with that. And the length of time that people are collecting benefits. We have to deal with that. On this question of advanced funding, as you mentioned, there was an effort to create a different type of financing stream, well, not just during the Bush administration, but throughout Congress in the 1990s. And we would actually be in much better shape today if we had transitioned to a partially pre-funded system rather than sticking with pay-as-you-go financing. Unfortunately, we are where we are, and there are no more Social Security surpluses left to save.
Question,
Yes.
if you don't mind, the disability, you said.
Yes.
And we know that during Obama administration, the disability benefit has been expanded and it's been proliferating. Now, why is that, and what can be done to stop it?
Well, I will tell you, the surge in disability benefits it's a pretty predictable phenomenon. Every recession, there has been an increase in disability benefit claims. That happens like clockwork. It was particularly severe this time because of the severity of the recession. Also, we have had a gradual increase in disability insured status for women in the workforce over the last several decades. So, disability rates are higher by virtue of that alone. And then there's the other phenomenon that I described, which is that the problem is hitting the disability system earlier than it's hitting the retirement system because people become disabled at younger ages, and you've got the baby boomers who are eligible for disability benefits earlier. The disability cost rose a lot in the last decade, and now we're projecting that a lot of that is going to gravitate to the retirement system. Those are the main things that are driving the disability shortfall. Disability is a huge problem, and I'm not saying we shouldn't independently deal with disability and some of the eligibility aspects of disability and the disability review process. I think that's important to do. But we also have to bear in mind that this isn't just a disability problem, just hitting it first. The retirement program is in just as bad a shape. Jason?
Two of your slides pointed out that besides just having a benefit issue and a tax issue for revenues and spending, we also have demographic issues. We have number of workers and beneficiaries and fertility. Should we be talking about what we could do to encourage more labor force participation and possibly even encourage fertility? And if so, what would they
Well, I'm a big believer in that, as you know, and I am very troubled by the fact that the Social Security system is basically designed to drive people out of the workforce. It reflects its 1930s design. If you go back and read the Committee for Economic Security report in the 1930s, they basically say, let's get these people out of the ranks of people looking for work, this is really sort of another aspect of the broader unemployment problem. And so they didn't pay much attention to making sure that seniors who continue to work got a good return for continuing to be there. But the current benefit formula is a problem in that regard. Your internal returns on your work as a senior drop through the floorboards once you hit 35 years of earnings. And we really ought to have a Social Security system that not only rewards people who stay in the workforce, but frankly penalizes people a bit more for leaving the workforce earlier than they need to. And with that, I guess we're ready for a panel of smart people. Thank you very much.
morning. Can you hear me? All right. Little louder. How's that? Is that good? Okay. I'm Jean Sahadi of CNN Money, and I'm very pleased to be here to moderate this panel today. I'm going to ask a few questions up top and then turn the discussion over to the audience to ask questions. We have a wonderful panel here. You've heard from Chuck. He laid out the issues really well for what we're going to discuss here, and I hope to touch on things like disability, chain CPI, and that ever controversial issue of taxes. But first, let me ask the audience, so the panelists have a sense of who they're talking to, on three basic questions. How many people here think that Congress really ought to address the long-term Social Security shortfall relatively quickly?
Am I allowed to vote?
No. Yep. So that looks like a majority. So when Congress does get around to addressing it, how many people here think that the solution should reside mostly on the tax increase side? A very small minority. How many people think it should reside primarily on the spending cut side? More people, but still not a majority. How many people think it should be a combination of the two? And there's your answer. Okay, perfect. Let me introduce the panelists, and then they are going to give a brief opening statement, and we'll then start the discussion. So we've heard from Chuck already. Also with us today is Jim Kessler, sitting next to Chuck. He is Senior Vice President for Policy and a co-founder of the think tank Third Way. He worked on the Hill for 12 years as a Democratic congressional staffer, most notably working for Senator Chuck Schumer of New York and former Congressman Chet Atkins of Massachusetts as their legislative director. Just last week, Jim authored a paper, which I believe is in the folder that you got, which basically argues that a Social Security fix can only happen if Congress appoints another national commission, and that the commission's work and a vote in Congress on the commission's proposals should happen no later than 2016. Next to Jim, we have Virginia Reno. She is Vice President for Income Security of the National Academy of Social Insurance. Before she joined the Academy, she worked at the Social Security Administration as Staff Director of the Policy Council. In that role, she helped advise the Commissioner of Social Security on legislative and regulatory issues. All this to say she knows the program pretty well. So if you want to argue with her, good luck. The Academy recently conducted a survey, which I think she's going to mention, that found that a majority of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, said that they don't think Social Security offers benefits that are sufficient and that they should go up in the future. And a majority also said that they would prefer tax increases as the solution. Lastly, we have Nick Troiano, who I can barely see. He is by far the youngest member on this panel. He is part of the CAN Kicks Back. He's a co-founder and field director for that group. They describe themselves as a millennial-driven campaign to fix the national debt. The group says it thinks any fiscal plan, not just about Social Security, but any plan to address the country's debt ought to be bipartisan and generationally balanced and touch all areas of the budget. It is a partner of the Campaign to Fix the Debt, which the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget has ties to, and Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, the former chairman of the President's Fiscal Commission, sit on the group's board. Nick himself is studying for a master's in government at Georgetown University. So with that, let's have introductory statements from Jim and Virginia and Nick. Jim, why don't you go first?
Great. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to make 5 very quick points. So first is there was good news for Medicare in the trustees report, but the news was not real good on Social Security. Despite a far stronger economy than we had over the past couple of years, the insolvency date remained at 2033. 6 or 7 years ago, the insolvency date was 2042. The poor economy has moved the insolvency date up. There was hope that a stronger economy would move it back. It did not. That is bad news. Number 2, we should all be stunned and disappointed by the level of complacency among, I would say, my fellow Democrats and progressives with regard to Social Security. And for example, yesterday, I just want to read something that Paul Krugman wrote in his column, quote, "All the talk of Social Security going bankrupt is nonsense. Even if nothing at all is done, the system will be able to pay most of its scheduled benefits as far as the eye can see." Just want to be clear, we're talking about a 23% across the board cut in benefits beginning in 2033. And just imagine how Paul Krugman and some of my progressive allies would howl if, let's say, Republicans had a plan to cut food stamps or Medicaid by 23%. We would be outraged, justifiably so. Democrats and progressives were the party and the movement that created the social safety net. We should be the one rushing to fix it, not hiding our head in the sand. Number 3, 20 years to insolvency is a long time for sure, but somebody born today, it would mean that Social Security is insolvent before that person is legal age to drink. It's closer than you think. Number 4, taxes must be part of any Social Security solvency solution, that is for sure, but it is a liberal fantasy to believe that we are going to solve this entire problem by getting rid of the payroll tax. Congress had a hard enough time eliminating the Bush tax cuts on millionaires. It will have an extremely difficult time adding 6 points to everybody's taxes for those above $115,000. Congress won't pass it, and it's not a great idea economically. And number 5, as Jean mentioned, the only way we believe to fix Social Security is through a commission. There's too much medicine for this ailment to administer for either party to do it on their own. They have to do it together. The only way they will do it is through a commission. That's the way it was done in the past. That's the way it will be done in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward
Virginia?
to some interesting discussion.
Thank you, Jean. Can you hear me? I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to be part of this very, very challenging and august panel. My key points are in your folders, and a little handout that looks like this, but basically 6 points. First, Social Security benefits are extremely important to the people who receive them, and that's been true for decades. And it looks like it's going to continue to be true into the future because other sources of retirement income, if anything, are weaker, not stronger than they used to be. So the first point is the benefits are really important to the people who get them. Second, the system delivers its retirement income remarkably efficiently, much more efficient than most other elements of the retirement income system. The administrative costs of the system are less than 1% of benefit spending, so that's remarkably efficient. So if we're looking for an alternative to Social Security, it's not clear it would do a better job. Third, and this is differs with some of my colleagues, I think, is the system is affordable. When you look at the system as a share of the entire economy, gross domestic product, it's now about 5%. It's scheduled to rise to 6% when all baby boomers are retired in the mid-2030s, and then it stays at about 6 to 6.2% for the rest of the next 75 years. That is remarkably predictable and affordable. So I would say we don't have a challenge of spending too much. And why is that so? Well, I think one of the least known facts about the future of Social Security, the recent history and future of Social Security, is benefits are already being cut by far more than most people recognize. We look back to 1983 and say, well, that was a grand compromise. And it was. It was a grand compromise to get through the 1980s because we were running out of money and could not have paid benefits, I think in the summer of the year in which the Congress finally acted. But the fixes for the long term, the ones that have a lasting effect, are all on the benefit reduction side. That is, by taxing more of Social Security benefits and having that money, fortunately for Social Security, going back to the Social Security system. That was part of the 1983 law. The 1991 legislation was focused on Medicare. It increased the taxes on Social Security benefits and had that money go back to the Medicare system. So that helps Medicare. But those two changes, taxation of benefit features reduce net outlays from Social Security by about 10% by 2050. So it's phasing down in that sense. The other major change that affects the long term is raising the age of eligibility for benefits from 65 to 67. And what that does is lower benefits at any year, any age they're claimed by between 6 and 7% per year, because that's the reduction for having claimed early. So that's a 13 to 14% change for 2 years. So those two things together is getting up in the vicinity of 23 to 24%. That's why benefits stay a relatively flat share of GDP at about 6%. So seeing the fact that benefits are not rising. Second, that the system is affordable and the people depend and rely on the benefits. In our recent survey, we asked people about their willingness to pay for Social Security currently and their willingness to pay more. And remarkably, both Republicans, Democrats, and independents agreed. If it's necessary to preserve Social Security for future generations, they agreed that working Americans could pay more in Social Security taxes and that wealthier Americans could pay more in Social Security taxes. We also gave them the opportunity to do an interactive exercise where they could put together packages of changes, and we had 4 benefit increases, 4 benefit cuts, and 4 revenue increases. And their preferred package was a combination of revenue increases and small benefit increases. That was the choice made by the American people. So I think there's an opportunity here to listen to the grassroots and think again what our options are. There are some good options. It doesn't have to be draconian.
Thank you, Virginia. Nick?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank you for the opportunity and also thank the organizers for doing something so rare when it comes to discussing long-term fiscal issues, and that's including the voice of the younger generation. It's almost like we have some stake in this game. I want to begin by sharing that last night I called home to get my parents to go through some old boxes to scan and send a letter to the editor that I wrote back in 2005 when I was in high school, warning of Social Security's insolvency, which was then projected to be in 2042, almost a decade later than it is now. And I mention that first because I've been nerding out on this issue for quite a while, and second because although the problem has gotten a lot larger, nothing else has changed in all that time, except the fact that I've went from writing letters to the editor in Milford to being on a panel in Washington, which is pretty cool in that time period. But I want to begin by making 3 points to add to the 11 that you've heard already. The first point is the problem that we face is much larger than most people talk about. In fact, it's almost twice as large. Over the long term, according to the Trustees report that came out, the full shortfall on Social Security is $23.1 trillion, which is much larger than the $9.6 trillion that the program faces over the next 75 years. That gap, which is called the infinite horizon fiscal gap, is the one that any meaningful plan to reform Social Security should close. And that's because our obligation is not just to make sure the program is there for those of us alive today, but that it's also there and solvent for future generations. The second point is young people and future generations are the ones who will foot the bill for the growth in Social Security spending. While current and past generations are projected to take more out from the program than they've paid in, the Trustees report also indicated that future generations will pay about $600 billion more in present value than they'll be expected to take out in the future. And while the pay-as-you-go system and demographic changes guarantee this outcome to a certain degree, I think any reform plan should focus on minimizing this generation gap so that Social Security doesn't just serve to transfer the savings and wealth of one generation to another. And third, it's important to keep in mind that as time goes on, our country is spending more and more on consumption in the present, including Social Security, than it is on investments in the future. What's stunning is that if you look in 1970, investments matched transfer payments to individuals at each about 30% of the budget. In the time since then, transfer payments have grown to 65% of the budget and investments have dropped to 14%. And those trends are continuing in that direction. So in considering what changes to make in Social Security, I think we have to take a holistic look at the federal budget because there are limited public resources out there and there is a limited political will to raise those resources. And I'd like to end on pointing out that those 3 points mention a lot of numbers, but this isn't just about numbers. This is about a moral obligation. Do we leave the next generation opportunity at economic prosperity, or do we leave them a giant IOU? That's the imperative of making Social Security sustainably solvent, and importantly, doing so in a generationally equitable way, and to do it soon.
Thank you very much. So I'm torn now whether I ask a question about taxes or ask about the 1983 Commission and why they didn't just resolve this so we don't have to be here so early in the morning. They only fixed the system. I know they were under the gun to get something done quickly because they were at risk of not paying full benefits in August of 1983. But they only got it together for 50 years. And here we are talking about 75 years and now the infinite time horizon, which only someone in the early 20s really thinks that long head. Is it realistic to think that way right now for us to do all of that? I mean, isn't it enough to do another 50 years? And if not, why not? Chuck, you have
Well,
something.
I mean, I would say there's a number of different questions there. I think
Yeah.
the first part is why didn't the 1983 Commission do more? I think the short answer is it's tough. Doing what they did was tough. That was really sort of the limit of what the political system could bear at that time. Remember, AARP fought against that. You had to have Republicans and Democrats join hands and overcome really vigorous opposition by the lobbying groups. So to have done too much more than they did, it might not have happened at all. And that's a very sobering message, because it means that by having delayed to the point where we now are, where we're facing a bigger shortfall than they did, or the one that they took on solving, we've really created a huge problem for ourselves, and it's been very irresponsible. And I think we have served ourselves very poorly by basically listening to the sort of the downplaying of the problem. We don't have to deal with this now. We have plenty of time to deal with it later, and that is a real problem. On the other question of what's the right measure, it's tough, because I think you can sometimes get into trouble when you use certain metrics that sound like they're fantastic and unrealistic, things like the infinite horizon metric, things like that. It sounds like you're trying to, be omniscient over all time and solve some problem forever and ever. That's not what it really means. What it really means is that you have to recognize that if the system is not on a sustainable course, that means what we are doing is we are locking in benefit schedules that we know over time are going to cost more than the tax revenue we're generating. So, like, for example, suppose you're a 25-year-old and you're thinking about how to prepare for retirement. Is it prudent to deliberately spend more than you're going to make over the next 40 years and to say, well, it's too big a problem to solve now. I'll worry about the rest of the problem when I'm 65. That would be a really stupid way to go about your financial planning. You should do the opposite. You should make sure that you're on a sustainable trajectory so that if there are unforeseen events and unanticipated outcomes, you're in a position to deal with them. So the reason we should have the system balanced on a sustainable basis is not because we're omniscient and can look forward over all time. It's because if we don't do that, we're going to put future generations in a situation where they aren't going to have the resources to deal with the problem. We should be doing the opposite. We should have the system on a sustainable course, recognizing the limits of our understanding, and then if they want to relax things a bit later, then they can do that.
But you said in 1983, 50 years was all the political system could bear, and my guess is the political system today can bear 6-7 minutes.
Well, that's true, and that's one reason why I'm worried. First of all, the 1983 reforms, they thought they were doing 75 years.
Right.
Okay, so they thought it was 75 years. Their assumptions were off. They had overly rosy economic projections. So yeah, it hasn't lasted all 75 years, but they thought that it was. But I recognize the problem, and but if we continue to have sort of this very short-term thinking, we're just not going to have a self-financing Social Security system at all. Because the trajectory that we're on, if we were to just say kick insolvency off for a few more years, we have to keep coming back and making tougher and tougher changes every few years in order to keep the system in balance, to the point where we're not going to be able to make them anymore. That's what we have to guard against. And this is of concern because there are already substantial signs that legislatures are unwilling to tax people at the levels necessary even to fund the current level of Social Security benefits. So, for example, we're constantly trying to refund back to people their payroll tax burdens through the EITC and the Making Work Pay tax credit and the recent payroll tax cut, because we're already uncomfortable with taxing people at the level required to pay the current benefits. If we don't deal with the situation, we have to impose even higher tax burdens. We just increase the chances that lawmakers are not going to be willing to assess those higher levels of taxes. And we get to that point, then we just can't have a payroll tax finance system. We're going to have a general revenue subsidized system, and then you're going to have a Social Security system with means tests and sudden benefit changes and a lot of other things that we don't have now. So if we want to have a system that can finance itself, we have to make sure we're not promising benefits in excess of the rate of taxes we know that legislators are willing to assess.
It's an excellent segue into, I'm sorry, do you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to,
Sure.
I'd also like to answer
Yes.
your question about why didn't the 1983 Commission fix it forever?
Right.
And I guess I'd like to just make a very clear, simple point, and I see some actuaries in our audience. Social Security is a defined benefit system. You can't put a defined benefit system on autopilot forever. They require periodic adjustment because they promise benefits that bear some relationship to wages, and they have to adjust to demographic changes. That's why we have a trustees report every year. That's why we have trustees, to be looking at the system and making sure that these changes happen. So you can't fix it forever. It's not a savings account. If it were, maybe yes. But the second point I'd like to make there is what the 1983 Commission didn't do was schedule tax rate increases out in the future to balance the benefit cuts that they put in place out in the future. Prior to 1983, there had always been some future tax rate increase scheduled. They were gradual, but they were put in place. That, in essence, would put the system on a sustainable course. You just simply need to schedule the taxes. You don't have to pay them all right now. You just schedule them out there when you know it's going to cost a little more. And those were the kinds of changes that the American people said, yeah, we could do that if that's what it takes. So the people are ready.
Mm-hmm.
I think the policymakers just need to think a little more clearly about the whole point of this program.
So let's talk about the tax issue. Jim, in his report, says that for anyone to think that we can do the heavy lifting strictly by eliminating the cap on wages that are subject to the payroll tax is a FICA fantasy and a pipe dream. Your survey says that's what people want to do, plus they want to gradually raise the tax rate on those wages over time by 1 percentage point for employees and also for employers. Nick will be paying more into the system as soon as you get a paying job and start paying into Social Security. You will be paying more into the system than you take out in benefits because of the taxes as they are now. So how do you sort of square that circle? I'm asking Jim and Virginia this in particular. I mean, Jim, you seem to be coming at it from a politically pragmatic point of view, but also to Nick's point, if you raise revenue to that extent just to pay for the Social Security shortfall, you're going to have less energy to raise revenue to pay for investments in the economy for the future. So could you both just talk to each other about that and work it out for the country?
Right, exactly. So yeah, look, I think Nick made a very important point, which is, we used to invest in this country. We used to do great things for investments, and we don't. And we, if you look at the Democratic legacy over the last 85 years, there are really two great Democratic economic legacies. There's the sort of Great Society New Deal legacies of FDR and LBJ, and that's the safety net. And with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, we have completed that safety net. That is the last major thread in that net, and took 85 years. And the other is the New Frontier investment programs. Those, that's the NASAs and et cetera, the things that, investments to help the country grow. As a Democrat, those are the two things we're really proud of. Well, one just grows, and the other is emaciated, and it's one of the reasons why we believe at Third Way that our economy isn't growing, that we're just not doing enough on investments. So theoretically, yeah, maybe you could raise a lot more taxes for Social Security. I'm very skeptical of that. Polling always shows that raising FICA taxes on wealthy people is very, very popular in the abstract, and then as soon as you get into the debate, it is completely different. I mean, once you get a public debate on that, it changes forever. We learned that on the Affordable Care Act, where support went. But the question is, if we're going to raise taxes to that level, that is probably the maximum we can raise taxes in this country for everything, and all of it is going to take care of Social Security. None of it is going to take care of Medicare, and none of it's going to do anything on investments. Where's this country going to be economically? I think in a very sad state. So we have to be careful.
Virginia?
I would agree we have to be careful, but I think we also can be just a little bolder. On the question of lifting the cap on earnings taxable for Social Security, there are 5% of workers who make more than that cap. 95% of everybody else pays into Social Security all year long. Their employer matches it all year long. 5% of people exceed that, and they stop paying in sometime during the year. So it's 5% of the electorate that's affected. Yes, they're a powerful 5%, but in our survey, we also found the top income tertile of Americans favored that in the same way that others did. So it's not clear. If you explain a rationale for this, it's part of the cost of living in a nation where we have a sound pension system for people who are old, disabled, and surviving children of workers who've died. That's just part of the cost of doing business. It's 6% for workers and employers each. The rest of the tax package that Americans say they're willing to do is 1 percentage point more for workers and employers each, for everybody. And those two things together are enough to pay for the Social Security system for the next 75 years, and plus some modest benefit improvements. So part of these revenue solutions focused only on the payroll tax, because it's true, we have lots of other ways to tax people, whether it's a carbon tax or a value-added tax or an income tax or inheritance tax. We have lots of other ways to try to raise money. We're not talking about using those things for Social Security. They need to be there for all of the other things that the nation needs to do.
But we should mention the payroll tax cap is set right now at $113,700. So basically, anyone making more than $114,000 would be subject, over time, would have all of their income subject to the 6.2% for workers, 6.2% for employer tax. But let me ask you, Virginia, when we talk about benefit cuts, or what is effectively a benefit cut, like raising the retirement age, isn't raising someone's taxes also effectively a benefit cut, because I'm paying more for what I am scheduled to get? Is the semantics of this debate are, you could just drink Advil all day. But, it doesn't, at the end of the day, affect the value of my benefits if I'm paying that much more to get them?
Well, it's part of the price of paying for the level of benefits that the American people seem to think they want. And by most international standards, our Social Security system is fairly modest. It's not
right. No one's saying you get too much money from Social Security.
It's not an overly generous system, and it does cover everybody, which is a great plus in terms of what we do with our federal dollars.
Nick, in your work at The Can Kicks Back, do you ever survey the millennial generation, which, by the way, is under 30, right? Under 30, under 31?
Sure.
Oh, sure.
Different definitions.
What do they want to do? What kinds of solutions do they favor, both on the tax side and the benefit side?
Well, the first thing that we did before launching the organization was join one of our partner organizations on a bus tour last August and met a lot of college students, about a dozen campuses. And I did a bunch of video interviews with them and didn't encounter one who expected Social Security benefits to be there for them. So they're awfully...
Okay, but that's not true. You tell them that's not true,
correct, right? But
because the system will pay out 3/4 of promised benefits. Okay, just as long as the workers, we're going to have a Social Security system. Go ahead.
So there's an awful lot of pessimism that the program's going to be there, or only I think Pew did a survey that showed only 1/4 of young people think that it's going to be their main source of income. So they're more willing to consider more drastic reforms. A majority believe taxes should be on the table. A majority believe benefit reductions should be on the table. And stunningly also, when the Pew did this poll, 89% were in favor of the idea of what they described as private accounts, which I think goes to show that our generation is willing to think outside the box, that just because we started doing something one way in 1935 doesn't mean it has to be done the same way now. And so I think there's room for young people to consider, well, what does personal accounts that supplement, not replace, or add on to traditional Social Security benefits look like in the future? And there are various advantages of considering that, knowing that we're investing in real assets rather than promises to tax the future, that this money is going to be there for them in an amount, at least the amount that they're going to put in, not less, and probably appreciate more. And it's money that the government can't borrow to fund other spending that they're not willing to tax for.
But that's a philosophical difference in terms of how the system was set up, I think, right? It was set up as an insurance system. So when you buy insurance, you're not paying necessarily into the system the amount you're going to get back. So I think philosophically, in 2005, you were in high school writing letters to the editor, but Chuck and others were arguing about this issue in public, and I don't know how you bring the two together. So
Sure, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that we know, young people know that what's scheduled may not be there for them, and so they're willing to consider a lot more options out there. But at the end of the day, I think the problem that we face isn't really a policy problem, because the numbers can be made to balance in various different ways. It's really a political problem. And we see, even though there are more eligible young voters vote half the rates in midterm elections than older voters. 6% of members of Congress are under the age of 40. So there's a strong lobby for the status quo, but what's really missing is a coalition for the future. And that's what we're sort of focused on trying to build.
Jim, Virginia, do you have a response?
Look, I think we do need to think a little bit outside the box. Virginia made a very good point about how the traditional defined benefit plan that a lot of American workers had in the past that's disappearing. So, the next time we're having a debate about raising the minimum wage, maybe we should be having a debate about requiring some minimum pension contribution for every employer that is a 401k type private account. So that when you're 17 years old and you're dishing ice cream at Baskin & Robbins, a little bit of money is going into that account, because people under the age of 30 have no retirement savings, and they're going to need something to supplement Social Security, whatever else they do. I think we need to really rethink what retirement security is in America going forward.
Virginia?
I would agree, but I would also point out that whatever retirement system we have going forward, you need a strong foundation, and that's all that Social Security really is. Yes, we need savings on top, but turning Social Security into a savings account makes it less secure, not more secure, because savings do get depleted for other things before you ever make it to retirement, because you're sick, because you have an accident, because all kinds of unforeseen things happen, which is the strength of insurance, which you have other resources to deal with emergencies, and the insurance is only there for the specified purposes: disability, retirement, and life insurance.
Let's switch gears for a minute to chain CPI, which, as you know, probably President Obama proposed in his budget. It was seen as controversial. It's a way to measure inflation that would then annually adjust annually adjust for cost of living retirees' benefits in a lesser way than is currently the case with the formula being used. In addition, it would also raise revenue. Republicans have not piped up about this, I don't know why, but because it would affect cost of living adjustments in the tax code too. But everyone's focused on how it would affect retirees and Social Security. What's your thoughts? Do you think it's a good idea, a bad idea? And I should also say, it's not typically a proposal that's about Social Security. Economists say it's a better way to measure inflation. What do you think? Anybody?
Sure. Okay, so this is what chain-weighted CPI is. You go to a store, there's grapefruit juice, the price went up from $2.49 to $2.89. You see orange juice, the price for orange juice stayed at $2.49. You think, I'll buy orange juice, and I don't really care that much. It's basically the substitution effect between two different products in which you're really pretty much indifferent about which one you would choose, and what the geeks at the Department of Labor, and I say that affectionately, have done is said that should be factored into how we do cost of living adjustments. And over the last 70, 80 years, the Department of Labor, those folks in there with their pencils, they have done this time and time and time again, and it's never been controversial. We've adjusted the CPI dozens of times, but because of a quirk in the way chain-weighted CPI uses, makes not how it makes the calculations, but how it would affect changes into the future, how it mechanically works. It needs to be done through legislation. My feeling is this: you either believe in science and evidence and facts, or you don't. You believe that the climate is changing. You believe that when you do a drug trial that the drug is effective or not effective based on it, and you believe in the economic data that's coming out, whether it works on your side or doesn't work on your side. My view is, of course, we should do change CPI. That is economically, mathematically, the correct formula as much as possible for inflation.
Virginia?
I think the reason why the chain CPI is topical and popular right now to talk about is because it would lower outlays in the federal government, and it would, if applied to the tax code, would increase revenues. And it's kind of a stealth way to accomplish both of those objectives. But whether it's a more accurate measure of the cost of living for people receiving Social Security, I think is open to question. People have said it may not be more accurate for low-income people. Then there's some evidence that the substitution effect was less for low-income people. There's some evidence that seniors don't have the same market basket of goods and services that other people do. Largely, they spend more for out-of-pocket for health care, and at least historically, health care has been rising much more rapidly than other parts of the market basket. So seniors have experienced a higher increase in the cost of living than is shown by the COLA adjustment that's now used. So you could argue this on the other side very, very effectively.
And are you in favor of targeting a new inflation index to seniors specifically? Because I think in the reformer, the calculator that the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget put out today, that is one of the options in reforming the program, and I think it would cost more money. Am I right, Mark? Yes. So you would not be saving money, you would be costing the system more money because you would be adjusting the inflation adjustments to specifically to what seniors buy. And on the grapefruit example, I just have to say that if you're taking medication, you don't want the grapefruit juice.
You're so correct. I stand corrected on that one.
But I was just saying, could I
Yes,
grant it?
sorry.
I mean, I just think that is a terrible idea. It's just a terrible idea.
Chain CPI is a terrible idea?
No. Chain CPI is a
Oh,
good
CPIE,
idea.
okay.
A special inflation index for seniors is a terrible idea. First of all, you have to remember, Social Security pays benefits to all sorts of people. Pays benefits to disabled, young disabled, pays benefits to dependent children. You know, a third of the beneficiaries are not elderly. So, you can't take an inflation, it doesn't make any sense to take an inflation measure that is designed for seniors and use it to index benefits for dependent children or the young disabled. And then you get into the soup of having different inflation measures for different subpopulations within Social Security. And then what do? You have the disabled people know that the retired people got a higher CPI than they did, and then, then there's a tussle over the age of conversion from disability to retirement. You get into all sorts of kooky things you don't want to deal with. Plus, as soon as you start divvying up the population into subgroups, there's no end to it. People are going to notice, hey, the cost of living went up a lot more in Manhattan over the last 10 years than it went up in Detroit. Why is it that the people in, New York are just getting the same COLA the people in Detroit are? So there's no end to that. And in addition to that, there is no even credible inflation index, senior specific right now. There's this experimental one that the Department of Labor has been doing called the CPIE. It doesn't even attempt to deal with purchasing substitution at all. So it's not even a chained index. It doesn't really even sort of aim for the sort of accuracy that the chain CPI does. With respect to these claims that somehow seniors are having higher rates of inflation than everybody else, in order to estimate that, you would have to, remember, a big portion of that claim rests on cost growth in healthcare. Well, a lot of cost growth in healthcare is not price inflation. A lot of cost growth in healthcare is improvements in technology and quality and things like that. And the CPI is not supposed to adjust for buying different things. It's supposed to adjust for price inflation. So, A, there's no index specifically for seniors that is remotely credible. And B, it's not a road we want to go down anyway, because once you do that, you're in the soup of having different inflation indices for different people on Social Security. That's just a policy disaster. There's no there. We should calculate our CPI based on our best measure of general inflation and be done with it.
Chuck does not feel strongly about that at all. We have about 15 minutes left, so I think maybe it's time to ask members of the audience. I think they're going to be passing around mics. So who's passing around mic? There's a gentleman in the front row here, and then a gentleman to the right over there, to my right.
Maybe my voice too.
Yeah, he doesn't need a mic.
Thanks. Excellent panel, excellent moderator. I'm glad I came all the way from California. All right. I have a question for Jim. and specifically on the legacy issue. And I certainly recognize that the legacy of the New Deal and the New Frontier has a lot of things to be said for it, but I'm an actuary, so I'm going to look at the numbers. And last year, I presented a paper at an actuarial conference, and the title of it was Legacy. And my point was that the first 3 generations of politicians in this country, the predominant legacy bracketed by the Revolutionary War and the Civil War was freedom. And I think a strong case can be made for that. But I think an even stronger case can be made that for the last 3 generations of U.S. politicians, the predominant legacy is debt. And this has troubled me enough that it even, and in my presentation, it drove an actuary to poetry, which has the question
Never
for you included in it. And the poem goes as follows. It's not an epic poem, it's quick. Higgledy-piggledy, Senator Sinecure promises everything voters may wish. But if his programs are unactuarial, can he provide with 2 loaves and 5 fish?
Is there a question?
I think, so first of all, I'd be very interested in seeing your paper. I think that the legacy, the intention wasn't to be debt. Maybe it is debt. I think the intention wasn't to be debt. I think the intention was to be security. That if you look at what Congress has done really post-World War II, really an attempt to make sure that people are taken care of, vulnerable elderly people, et cetera, and that as our economy grew, part of a reaction to the Great Depression, but as our economy grew and we got stronger and our growth between 1946 and 2007, our average annual growth was 3.3% a year. Sure, there were ups and downs, but if you have robust growth like that, you really feel like, okay, this is the opportunity where we can take care of people. If you look out into the future, whether it's CBO or OMB or Goldman Sachs or IMF or the CIA fact book, U.S. growth over the next 30 years is supposed to average 2.3%. So there's 1 point difference, and 1 point doesn't sound like a lot, but it makes all the difference in the world, and it really makes it so that that safety net that we created, is it possible to really afford it? And what needs to happen is we need to have a much more growth-focused agenda, and our concern is the safety net is critically important, but we have the amount of money that we spend on securing people and making sure that they don't have disasters in their lives or they can overcome them, versus the amount that we're spending to create an income stream for this country that's, investments and to create growth. I think that it's gotten out of whack, and it's hurting us. And economics is about making choices with scarce resources, and we've been afraid to make those choices.
The gentleman over there, and if you could actually state your name and where you're from.
Thayer Phillips from Retire Safe.
Thank you.
I want to make some comments about the chain CPI discussion. A couple of things. That chain CPI has been around since Greenspan and hasn't been implemented. So a lot of people have known about it but have chosen not to implement it. The second point is that if the chain CPI wouldn't have lowered but rather would have raised the CPI, would we have had this discussion at all? Would it be part of the president's budget? I don't think so. So I think it was used for a different reason than what it was made for. And the third comment is, if we're going to look at 2/3 of the Social Security recipients, you talked about 1/3 that were under retirement age. If we're going to look at the 2/3 and decide not to compute a CPI for them because it might cause some problems, that just seems disingenuous to the point that if we could create a fair CPI by each person, if we had the ability to do it, why not? If Detroit and New York is different, why not? If a senior has a different way of purchasing, why not? If we're going to really,
Is that a question for Chuck?
if we're really going to do that, why not?
Well, I would say, first of all, you made a number of points there. Yeah, the issue of CPI overstating inflation has been around, back to Greenspan and before, and I would say it hasn't been ignored. We've actually adopted a lot of pieces of it over time as people have recognized that there were problems with the way inflation was measured before. As I think Jim was saying, the BLS incorporated as many improvements, refinements in how inflation was calculated as they could under the law. But there are limits that what can be done under the existing statute. The reason that we use the CPIW for Social Security is not because anyone thinks it's the most accurate measure. In fact, CPIW is only captures one third of sort of the population sample relative to CPIU. Why do we use CPIW instead of CPIU? Because CPIU didn't exist at the time that Social Security COLAs were established, so the law just happens to say that it uses CPIW. It's not because people think it's a superior inflation measure. And as to whether we'd be talking about, an inflation measure if it had a different effect from chain CPI, I would say yes. And in fact, I think the evidence of that is what we're doing right now. We're using an inflation measure that probably causes us to overpay COLAs relative to actual inflation, but we're using it because of sort of the statutory history and what we're supposed to use, even though it actually causes an increase in outlays relative to what we would get if we did a more refined inflation calculation. So I think whether it would be a savings or an increase, it would be on the table, and the proof that it would be on the table if it were an increase is the fact that we're using one right now that's actually an increase relative to actual inflation. And then on the last question, I would just this is a subjective personal view, but I would just disagree with the idea that we should go down the road of trying to have a separate CPI for every specific case. I think there is a virtue in the system to having one COLA that applies to everybody. We have one retirement age that applies to everybody. The Social Security system is complicated enough without everybody having their own individual COLA, without everyone having their own individual retirement age. I think you get into all sorts of fairness issues and resentments and all sorts of difficulties once the government starts picking and choosing and saying this group gets this COLA and that group gets that COLA. Because, where do you draw the line? You have, if we find that women versus men have different buying patterns, or people in this region of the country versus that region, or by age, it just puts us at a point where there's definitely a matter of diminishing returns at that point, and I think it becomes sort of a specious accuracy, and creates a lot of complexity with very little policy gain.
Virginia, did you want to respond to, or should we go to the next question?
Not on the,
Okay.
not on the COLA.
We'll switch back and forth. There's a gentleman here and a woman on the right.
Hi, Jim Colby with the German Marshall Fund and McClarty Associates. I want to go to about the same time that we had the commission, we also changed the federal retirement system. And we put into place a modified 401k with the thrift savings plan, which has been quite successful, I think, and very popular with federal employees, several million federal employees and now military participating in that. It's going back to what Nick said earlier. It's that generation that's going to bear the brunt of if it were to fail or the success of it. And why do we think that we can't really discuss diverting a small part of the payroll tax into a 401k for people along the lines of a thrift savings, with all the kinds of protections you have, that you can't take it out from except on the most extreme circumstances, that you have a default that it goes to government securities if people don't make a choice. It seems to me this is a reasonable way in which we could do something for the next generation, where we might actually have a growing retirement income. And I think people do think of it as a retirement income, not really as a savings account.
Virginia, do you have a response to that?
Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with trying to build in a savings component, but the truth is that what we're allocating to the Social Security system is very bedrock basic, and to undermine that in order to create a savings account, I think reduces the security for future generations, as well as as for current generations. And quite frankly, some of the proposals, when you look at the Bowles-Simpson proposals, looking out into the future, their most draconian cuts are for the youngest workers, for those not even in the workforce yet, for 5-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds. So they phase in cuts that are gradual, but they go out a long time. What hasn't been done, and what it would be far more effective, is to phase in contribution rates that keep the system sound rather than continuing to shave it and get it smaller and smaller.
I think we have time for one more question. There was a woman on the right side of the audience.
Hi, I'm Becky Thies from the Economic Policy Institute. Thank you so much for your comments. I'd like to challenge Jim Kessler on your point that raising the payroll tax cap is not really a good idea economically. The way I see it, we have historically low marginal tax rates. We have the top income earners taking home significantly more money than they have in the past. We have low rates on tax and capital income. It seems to me like this is something that can be absorbed by top income earners. So why do you think this is not a good idea economically? I totally get the politically part of it, but it seems to me like we can absorb it. Particularly, we just absorbed basically locking in the Bush tax cuts. I mean, why not do something like this?
Thanks for your question. Let me clarify that a little bit. If there was a plan out there that said, okay, we're going to tax 6.2% on every person earning over $113,700, okay? Obviously, it would need to be phased in, but look, I think for the most part, I think this country could handle it. I think the economy could handle it, but not if it was all going to shore up Social Security. If that money was going to, build the best, make it so that our infrastructure system, that we moved energy, power, ideas, goods, people, product, better, faster, cheaper than any other place in the world, if that money was dedicated to that, I think, okay. And then some of it was to shore up the safety net, I think, okay, we could do that. But that level of taxation that would go completely to consumption spending, I think would not be good for the U.S. economy. And I would think at that point we have reached and perhaps past the limit of what this country will allow us to tax and to spend. And I think that it's very hard to separate the politics from the policy here. I think that, I've been in Democratic politics for a long time, and I've seen every time that Democrats, people think that we've gone too far. Voters 2 years later send us packing, that we overreach. And that would be an overreach. We think it wouldn't be, but it would be when the time came. But again, if it went to most of that to investments, yeah, I think we could swallow it. But I think to consumption, no, we could not.
Do you want to weigh in, Virginia?
Yeah, I would like to just comment on that, and thank you, Jim. I guess one thing that strikes me as absolutely true is things change, but they don't change until you begin to change the conversation. And yes, that seems like a radical idea to say that the top 5% of workers should pay into Social Security all year long, just like everyone else does. That doesn't sound strange to the other 95%. But it's an idea putting out there. Yeah, it sounds odd because it hasn't been done yet. But we look back in history, and the history isn't that far back. In the Eisenhower administration, the top income tax rate was 90%. Today, we choke over tax rates in the 30 percentiles. Things change, and our capacity to pay. In the past, there was much greater willingness of policymakers to say, what do we need to do and how are we going to pay for it, rather than how are we going to reduce taxes?
Can I just
That's
say
a very
something about that
different
90% though?
Sure.
We had tax rates that high because we were paying off World War II and defeating the Nazis and defeating the Japanese, and now we're trying to defeat aging. And it's going to turn out to be a harder battle. And that, so those 90% tax rates, which were on very few people, and look, we can tax wealthy people more, but to go back to that nostalgia of that time, it was a very particular moment in time when this country was also growing by leaps and bounds. This country does not grow by leaps and bounds. We are a middle-aged country with love handles. And we are not, that's what we are.
We have these young
Yes, thank you, Nick. But we are not the country. We are a great country and we have a great future, but we are not growing at that rate anymore where we could do those sorts of things and we could afford to tax at those levels. It's a different country that we're in right now.
And I'm going to give you, and then Nick, the last word.
All right. Thank you. I just sort of a three thoughts on your question. One is I think we have to be careful. I'm reminded of a point I think you made in your opening comments of that. Often there's a tendency to try to sort of exaggerate the political palatability of certain tax increases until they're ready to occur, and then people start realizing, oh, this is going to affect me more than I thought. I think this is a classic example. It's often said, as Virginia cited, and I hear this a lot, that only 5% of people would be affected. But that's only 5% a particular year. 20% of people will actually be affected by this. 20% have people income over the cap over their lifetime. So you're hitting not 1 out of every 20 people with a tax increase, but 1 out. Yeah, it's 20%.
Yeah.
Because people's their incomes fluctuate. Some years you're below the cap, some years you're above the cap.
He will go above the cap at some point.
I know.
He's
Yeah,
there now.
exactly. So yeah, he's below. So you've got 20% of the population that realize at some point will realize I'm going to be hit with this tax cap increase. And the only reason I mention that, not to say that we couldn't hit 20% versus 5%, it's just that you don't want to get in this situation where you've told a bunch of people, oh, we're only affecting the super rich, and then everyone discovers when push comes to shove, oh, we don't support that as much as we originally thought, because that's going to hit me too. Second point is that, my preferred answer would not be to do that. Personally, I personally would sign on to a lot of plans to get the problem solved, even if it includes things that wouldn't be my preferred proposal. I tend to see this as unresponsive to our basic problem. Our basic problem is that we have a system where costs are growing faster than our economy, basically. You can't really solve the problem until you have a system that isn't growing as fast as your economy is. So I see this as kind of just buying time and unresponsive to the main problem, but I could live with it if it were in the context of a plan that solved the problem as a whole. And finally, raising the cap on taxable wages, you have to bear in mind there's a substantive technical issue here, which is that you have to make a choice. If you raise the cap on taxable wages, remember benefits and contributions are linked. So in effect, what you're doing is you're increasing the tax contributions of higher income people, but you're also increasing high income people's benefits at the same time. So it's a very inefficient thing to do from the standpoint of system solvency. And do we really need to have a solution that's actually increasing the benefit payments to be up on the high income end? Now, the alternative to doing that is to increase the tax max, but don't credit it towards benefits. And that would basically sever the contribution benefit link. And that would basically, for the first time, start asking people to put into Social Security without getting anything back. So there's technical problems with raising the cap on taxable wages. It's either very inefficient or you have to sever the contribution benefit link. That's why a lot of plans, I think Bowles-Simpson, when they went about this, they did this very smart. They had an increase in the taxable wage base, and they phased it in very, very slowly. And they also, at the same time, reduced the benefit accruals by people on the high income end. So if you couple it with a reduction in the benefit accruals for people on the high income end, it's not nearly as inefficient. So doing it by itself is very problematic. Doing it in the context of other benefit changes, especially on high income end, is, I think, much more promising.
A quick last word to Nick.
Yeah, the point that I would just add on to Jim's comments earlier on the premise that we have limited resources and political will to raise those resources on the question of investment versus consumption is what kind of problems are we trying to solve as a country? I think Social Security has been effective in lifting a lot of seniors out of poverty. And one interesting point is in 1975, both elderly poverty and child poverty was about equal at 15%. In the time since then, the number of seniors living in poverty has dropped to 8.5%. The number of children living in poverty has grown to 21.5%. So in considering what to do with additional public resources, we have to figure out what kind of problems we're trying to solve, because we have that same size of the pie. And I guess the point I'd like to add on is a lot of people talk about bipartisanship and both parties working together. We like to talk about generationship and each generation trying to work together. And it's great to be part of a conversation in which we can do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick, Virginia, Jim, and Chuck. And thank you to the audience, and thanks to the sponsors of the
Thanks, everyone, for coming. We really appreciated having you. And if you want to reform Social Security on your own, check out www.socialsecurityreformer.org. Thanks, everyone.